Good morning, everyone. Welcome. You could say hey back at me. we're very interactive. I mean, we're in a bigger room today, which could be a good thing today, right? But yeah, we still want to try to keep an intimate conversation going. And there's the people on the webcast who they can tweet us a hey if they want to. So my name is Jennifer Turner, and I've been directing the China Environment Forum for 20 years. I have to kind of say that this year because that's kind of a special number somehow. But what's embarrassing, and I was just talking to my speakers, that in my 20 years here, I have never had a meeting on rural climate action in China and the US. So it's a big oversight, but then Badisha comforted me saying that I'm not the only one who's been overlooking rural America and rural China in terms of climate action. I mean, as we all know, US and China are the top two emitters of CO2 emissions. And again, like my meetings, like everyone else around town and in publications, that the conversation's usually on the electricity grids, heavy industry, urban buildings, urban transportation. But today we're going to shift the focus. I'm so excited about this, and dive into what are the possibilities. Come on in terms of rural climate action, because agriculture is also a major source, and there could be steps taken that could help make communities in agriculture areas more resilient. Now, again, as I said, this is the first time we've had this kind of topic. So my four stellar people on the panel, they're great, but we're not going to answer every question today. So it's kind of an agenda setting, but I think you have to start somewhere. So, but the goal is that we want to kind of take a look at the potential of win-win in rural climate solutions that's good for the communities and the planet. So kicking us off, our agenda setting person, and also full disclosure, this is a little bit her fault because the Center for Badisha Bachara, she's the Deputy Director for Climate and Energy Policy at the Center for American Progress. So she and her team, it's a energy and ag, it's a climate
energy, but
climate and energy, and they've also just now started looking into ag. They wrote this kind of overview piece. And it kind of came at a good time because I just have been having a conversation with my friend Ming Yang over at Global Environment Facility about some of the things that Jeff is starting to do, looking at zero rural economy in China. And this all happened in the same week. And if any of you speak Chinese, yuan fun, fate and destiny. This panel was meant to be. So kicking us off, Badisha is going to give us an overview of kind of clean energy, soil enrichment, and other actions that not only make it rural economies low carbon, but more resilient. But I should add, too, that I know that you've worked in rural India on renewable energy. So in the Q&A, we may talk to you about some of those insights. She also was up on the Hill doing ag and energy as well. So just so you know, your questions can go beyond what we talk about today. Pippa Ellis, she's the Director for Agriculture in North America at the Nature Conservancy. It's that little green group you may have heard of, yeah? She's has led land use policy advocacy at UN climate negotiations. I thought it was pretty cool that you led a group of NGOs that kind of helped insert land use and forestry into more of the conversations and hopefully standards and targets in the climate agreement. Today, she's going to focus on U.S., TNC's work across the agricultural supply chain in the United States to increase the adoption of climate mitigation practices. So she's not here to talk about TNC's China work, but we might be able to squeeze a few bits of info out of her on that. Then we have Ming Yang, who I already mentioned. He's the Senior Climate Change Specialist at GEF, and he's been involved in a number of the pilot renewable energy projects, which, as at the very beginning I mentioned, a lot of those are the big farms serving the city. But what's really neat, he's going to talk about what's been happening in terms of renewable energy writ large in China quickly, and then look at, well, what's the shift in focus that's now going to go towards ag and rural electrification. And last but not least is Karen Mansell, who is a tough person to introduce, tough and not tough. Karen, she's actually a professor of food, ag, and biological engineering and water quality specialist at Ohio State University. And since 2006, she's been working in rural China, in villages, working on wastewater and soil issues. And the funny thing happened in the way of like a tenured professor, decides that she's going to get her third master's in public policy. And part of the requirement was she had to do internships in Washington, D.C. So I've been super lucky to have an incredibly talented ag scientist now for the second spring in a row. And so Karen, she brings a unique, boots on the ground, because she only works in small villages, because there is a fairly urbanized rural areas, which we can talk about as well in the Q&A. But she's going to dive into methane capture. So she does all the glamorous things. So we're talking poop, right? So we're good with this. But how this can also be a way to help the digestate to enrich soils and carbon capture. And I don't want to steal her thunder. So with that quick intro, quickish, maybe not quick enough intro, we're going to kick off, and I'm going to ask Mitigation to come on up. Your job as the audience is to think of difficult questions to ask them in the Q&A. But can we get some applause for my rural climate action team here?
Thank you.
All right, thank you. And I assume I just changed slides with this. So thanks so much for coming to this. My name is Bidisha Bhattacharya. I'm at the Center for American Progress. We're right up the road. And I'm on the energy and climate team there. And so we have been thinking about climate change and climate action across the economy. And I am really excited to be here to speak today about U.S. ag a little bit, which Pipa's going to dive into as well. So, I think the main takeaway from me that I'd love for everyone to kind of think about today is how rural America and rural communities can benefit from climate action. And I think that's not something that is often said in the media and other places where there's a lot of sort of messaging around, oh, this is going to cost jobs, this is going to cost, whatever, this is going to have economic costs, et cetera. And that's actually does not have to be the case at all. So that's kind of what I wanted to speak about today. So before getting into rural specifically, I just wanted to level set. I'm sure many people here are familiar with kind of the overall climate space, but the goal that the world and scientists have coalesced around and are telling us is necessary to reach, which is a very, very arduous, ambitious goal, is limiting warming to 1.5 degrees globally Celsius. And so if you think about the Paris Agreement, that was based on those targets were based on a slightly different goal because they were before the last IPCC report came out. So they were targeting more like, they said well below 2 degrees, but 1.5 was a new benchmark, essentially, that the whole policy world is grappling with, the scientific community is grappling with, and all sectors are grappling with. And what this means many, many things. The difference between 1.5 and 2 are quite stark. But one thing it means for sure is that there's no longer these silver bullet solutions for policy. People have talked about a carbon tax or cap and trade and things that can just, Congress can do, and then suddenly we will be able to kind of touch and affect all the sectors as much as we need to. That was never really the case anyway, but I think that was how it was talked about quite a bit before. And now I think everyone is recognizing like 1.5 is a whole different ballgame, and we can't just do one thing. We have to kind of act across the economy, pull a lot of different policy levers, pull investment levers, as well as other pieces in order to make this happen. And that includes in agriculture. So it's a new reality that we're working in, and I think everyone is, including us, are trying to figure out what that means. So we put out a report last year called 100% Clean Future, if anyone's interested, where we sort of paint CAP's overall vision across the economy of what that actually means to hit 1.5. So just a quick talk about greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. Overall, they actually went up in 2018 after 3 years of going down, which was quite alarming. But then they went back down in 2019, still slightly above where they were in 2016. So this is not like some great grand story still, but largely due to natural gas replacing coal in the power sector. But alarmingly, all the other sectors continue to not make any progress. So, it's not the rosiest picture right now when it comes to U.S. emissions and kind of the trajectory that we are on if we don't do something. So moving on to agriculture. Agriculture makes up about 10% of U.S. emissions, and we're talking about direct emissions. So there's a whole supply chain involved in producing ag inputs and stuff that captured in a different part of the EPA's inventory on greenhouse gases. So, but that's kind of just to level set on kind of where we're at. And if you look at where it's coming from. It's largely coming from uses of inputs that are, use fossil fuels, both in and when you apply those, there's nitrous oxide that is emitted from the land sector, and so that's about half of the ag emissions. Livestock is a huge space, so I know we're going to be talking more about digesters and methane with folks who know a lot more about it than I do. But that is another major area, both from kind of manure management systems as well as direct enteric fermentation that happens in livestock. And then there's those are the two major pieces, and then there's just actual direct CO2 emissions that are coming off of farms, which are running diesel based tractors and other equipment. So at the same time that all of this is happening on the climate side, rural communities are also facing a whole host of challenges. So last year in November, CAP, my organization, ran a bunch of focus groups in various rural communities, talking to them about kind of what's on their mind, kind of top of mind. And we heard a lot of different things, but, and a lot of it was sort of this feeling that things were changing in their communities. And this is not to paint rural communities in America in a broad brush at all, but just reflecting what we heard. But things are changing. Weather patterns are changing. Winters are wetter. Summers are wetter. Summers are hotter. There's a lot of that kind of feeling of uncertainty. And there's also other things going on. Water quality came up over and over as something rural communities really care about. And then thinking about the loss of farmland, which has become, as urban areas sprawl out more and more land is lost to development. So these are different issues that no one brought up climate per se, but these are issues that people are talking about. And the interesting thing is that they all relate to climate in some way or the other, whether they're a cause or an effect or something that can be addressed by also taking action on things that are good for climate change. So that was one of our kind of very interesting takeaways coming out of it. And if you think about the statistics, $3 billion last year estimated spent on flood damage recovery in the Midwest. I'm from the Midwest. I'm from southern Minnesota, so I know firsthand kind of what these communities looked like. And that meant 19 million acres went unplanted. So huge economic losses due to the flooding. Fields just flooded. The fields that were planted, people couldn't harvest. There was a shortage in fuel to be able to run dryers, to be able to get grain out of the ground. So there's just a lot of issues economically. Farms have been experiencing increased bankruptcies as a result of this and other factors. And like I said, there's 31 million acres were lost to development between 92 and 2012. And then the data we've seen sort of since then is less precise, but indicates that there's a similar trend still happening. So kind of a lot of different factors that all could be are not attributed to climate change necessarily, although some of them definitely have a tie, but that are being talked about actively in rural communities. So that is all not happy, but the good thing is that we took a hard look, and I know Pipa's going to talk about some of this as well, but what are the policy solutions that can counter some of the, not just climate change, but that can counter some of the issues that we heard from that rural communities and folks in these places are facing and thinking about. And so we put out a report, which you're all welcome to read. It's scintillating, but we kind of did a bunch of math on different existing USDA programs. So it's not even authorizing new things necessarily for the most part, and what a federal investment strategy can do to drive up rural economies. And, by our estimates, you could drive $8 billion newly into rural communities through compensating them for a bunch of things that are good, not only for climate and addressing it, but also in addressing some of the other issues that they are concerned about. So I'm not going to get in super detail on the specific policies or the programs, but if you want to talk about those, we absolutely can. But, there's a whole chunk of opportunity, as I mentioned earlier when we were talking about where the emissions are coming from, in working lands that are actually in production, and thinking about agricultural practices like planting cover crops, no-till, et cetera. A lot of people talk about this stuff. But, it's still, the uptake is still not huge, especially on the cover crops, which is, I think, about only 15 million acres out of like 400 million acres that are using cover crops. And, these types of practices can both help sequester more carbon, which is good for climate, but also do a whole host of other things, reducing the nitrous oxide emissions if you're reducing input usage through various practices, if you're preventing soil erosion, runoff into waterways, and resilience from flooding, which was such a huge issue. So a lot of co-benefits in addition to a climate impact in this space. And so, we're thinking about how can farmers be better compensated and incentivized to adopt these practices as part of a broader climate program driven by federal investment in recognizing the value and the positive externalities of doing these practices. I'll also note that it's not just enough to throw money at the problem. You need to increase the technical assistance capacity, et cetera, at certain, and there's a variety of ways you can do that through USDA and other kind of state and local entities to do so. The second bucket is conservation. So these are lands that are no longer are taken out of production or and are allowed to kind of regenerate and move back into their original state, and or intentionally cover planting along waterways, et cetera, to increase the to protect the soil, prevent erosion, increase the amount of resilience that area has to flooding and other things. And so there are a lot of great programs that already exist to do this stuff. They can be scaled up. They can be tweaked to better prioritize climate goals as well. And so I think there's quite a lot of potential there that a lot of folks are talking about. And this is just on the agriculture side, but more broadly in rural areas. CAP's doing a lot of work on the conservation side and public lands and private lands and forestry to think about, people who like private lands that are forested. How do you protect those, and how do you compensate folks for the ones that have the highest carbon potential? So there's a lot that you can do there. The next area is livestock, which I know Karen's going to be talking about methane in a variety of places. But there's, this is methane digesters and other solutions are out there. I think there's an opportunity to do a lot more there. EPA estimates that, it could be potentially profitable to put anaerobic digesters on over 8,000 dairy and livestock operations in the U.S. But there's a lot of kind of upfront cost and technical assistance that's needed. So the adoption has been pretty low. And then I think there's also some R&D needed to make these technologies more viable for other types of livestock. So a lot to be done there, but I think there's also a huge opportunity to be able to do that through policy mechanisms that already exist and programs that already exist. So renewable energy is another one, thinking about rural resilience in kind of a broader frame and thinking about how to both reduce, increase one thing that comes up as a theme is the viability of agriculture as a profession, and how do you reduce costs and do that and make it more profitable. And a lot of the things we're talking about here can do that. They're new revenue streams essentially. But renewable energy allows for that in certain instances, and also you can reduce costs through energy efficiency. So there's some great opportunities to do both renewable energy development on farm and in rural communities, and increase the energy efficiency of farm operations. Again, there's some great programs that already exist that can be plussed up and kind of directed with more of a climate lens focus to do that. Rural utilities also play a major role in this. So they are, the rural electric co-op network that exists in the U.S. Is a huge player in this and serving rural areas. So, and they also currently have a lot of debt and a lot of coal that they're burning. So there's some other factors there that I think, and then the grid needs to be updated to be able to actually bring more of these renewables online. So there's a lot of different things that need to happen in this space, but it's all stuff that can be done. We just have to do it. And the fifth bucket is kind of this broad bucket of innovation. So there's a lot of R&D that USDA does already, but can do a lot more in coming up with new ways to reduce input use and nitrous oxide emissions, like I mentioned earlier, to reduce methane through different types of technologies. Precision agriculture is a whole bucket of technology solutions. I used to work in a previous role in an impact investing firm, and we were looking a lot at the agriculture space and different companies that are coming up and producing, using big data and machine learning and things and sensors in the ground and sensors through drones, all kinds of stuff. So there's a whole lot happening in this space, but there's a lot that the government can do to kind of channel what is deployed, because there's a lot of like upfront development cost, but then actually getting farmers to use it, it's very confusing. There's a million technologies out there. Which ones are the good ones? Which ones actually are going to save them money? That's a lot of questions that I think the technical assistance side can play a big role. And then thinking about soil carbon measurement is another huge area right now that there needs to be better solutions for. So you can actually understand what's being sequestered, and track, and that also helps create markets for soil carbon. So those are, I'm sure, buckets that many others here are going to be talking further about, but that's just a broad overview of kind of what is possible. So
Thank you so much. I love it that we're talking about rural, and you keep using the term buckets. I like that. So as I switch the PowerPoint here, I want to, Badisha, I want you to maybe answer a quick question as you're talking, that you just say a little bit about how you talked about how when you interviewed farmers, they didn't talk much about climate change.
Yeah.
Give me more.
Yes. So, I mean, this was super interesting because there was, let me rephrase that. It wasn't that they didn't talk about it. It's that they didn't bring it up. And then when you would ask about it, some would say, yeah, I think it's a real thing. Some would say, I don't know if like climate change is a real thing, but the weather has been crazy. And so it's sort of this, semantic thing almost. And then I think there was a lot of people who would say things like, definitely things are changing. I don't know what's causing it. So there's a gap in believing or understanding why, but they are seeing this happen every day. So there's no question that something is going on. And things are different than they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. Things are definitely different than they were when their parents were farming that same farm. So and that's not just farmers. I think it's more broadly like rural folks. We had I don't have the statistic in front of me, but there was a poll on I think it was I'm not going to make up a number that's wrong, but a very large number of rural Iowans who cited damage from flooding last year. I mean, it's just like people know and see what's going on, whether or not they're attributing it specifically to climate change that's caused by human greenhouse gas emissions. So
Okay, we'll hold off other questions and we'll have people come up, and then because I always kind of feel like it kind of rounds it out, because I kind of think that was an important issue. Thinking about, you want to do climate action, maybe, but it didn't matter. People are still interested in talking to you about this stuff.
Yeah, at least the challenges that they're seeing.
Yep.
So.
All right, Pipa, this is you.
Yeah, this is a perfect introduction. So I'm Pipa Elias. I'm the Director of Agriculture for North America at the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy's mission is to protect the lands and waters on which all life depends. And our vision is a future in which both people and nature thrive. This is different from a lot of other environmental organizations that are a little more focused just on the nature side. And this is one of the reasons why I love working on agriculture at the Nature Conservancy, because I can think of kind of no better connector between people and nature than agriculture. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is kind of how when farmers farm with nature and like nature, it can help them be part of the climate solution, and it can actually really help them as people and in their operations. So it's a little hard to see, but this is just a beautiful picture of Indiana. So when we think about kind of American rural landscapes, and the Nature Conservancy is out there talking about how they can be part of the climate solution, that has actually been really compelling, and it'll be interesting to kind of talk as a panel later about how that narrative has changed over the past few years. And when we put this in terms of kind of a solution that is in people's hands, it's much more widely accepted. So when thinking about the buckets that Badisha laid out, I'm going to be talking today about working lands, about within the row crop system in the U.S., what the options are for climate mitigation.
Let me see if I'm going to ask my AV. Could you lower the lights a little bit on the screen so people can see the images better? We're kind of a hard thing because we want to
fine.
see
Yeah,
you.
it's no
You're fine?
problem.
Okay, never
Yeah.
mind.
I
Ignore
think
me.
that was the only one that was
Ignore me.
just a picture. The rest have, I think, are a little brighter. So I'm going to go just real briefly into the detail of what some of these activities are in row crop agriculture. So these are the practices that improve soil health. So similar to any other ecosystem, the soil is an ecosystem, and it needs to be living. So what helps make it live? All those really kind of micro and megafauna in the soil. So the first is use of cover crops. So after a farmer harvests their main cash crop for the year, most of our work is in corn and soybean systems. So come October, November, when they're harvesting, they have another crop that's growing over the winter. That cover crop helps protect the soil from erosion in all these increasing winter and spring storms. So there's less rainfall kind of getting to the soil. And then it also provides a living root in the soil throughout more of the year. So similarly to us, soil bacteria need both a diverse diet and they need to have something in there. And so the having living roots in the system is critical for soil's health. Having a more diverse crop rotation. So again, this is thinking about kind of like our own diet. We need to have a diverse diet. So we're looking at how we can have not just kind of the same ground growing corn every year or soy every year, but having just a little more diversity in the rotation. And the third is reducing tillage. This looks different on every farm, but essentially it's just disturbing the soil less. So that kind of old vision we have, of the American Midwest being just completely plowed up, that is not how nature works. If you think about any place you've been out in nature, there's really rarely ever any bare soil, right? It really wants to be covered and cozy. So you can have a bunch of different ways you can have less disturbance to the soil, but that's really important for not breaking up that ecosystem. And then foundational to all of this is nutrient management. So again, like humans, we need some nutrients in our system, in our diet. So there is a role for using fertilizer and nutrients in row crop agriculture in the U.S., but it just needs to be done the right way. It needs to be done efficiently and effectively so that the nutrients are going where they're needed into the plants rather than where they're not needed. And this is something that it's actually kind of the start of how we got into conservation in agriculture, because it's very easy to tell a farmer, like, why would you put fertilizer down in a way or in a place or at a time of year where it's just going to run off into the stream? You're paying for something that is literally just going out the door. So this is kind of how a lot of our work actually started. So what is the potential impact of these practices on climate mitigation? This is from a paper that a number of my colleagues at the Nature Conservancy, as well as many other partners, published in 2018, Natural Climate Solutions in the U.S. This is a U.S. version of a global paper that some of my other colleagues at the Nature Conservancy published in 2017, I believe. And this is just the kind of agriculture portion of that. But this looks at a number of options like cover crops that I just mentioned, nutrient management is there in the middle, and looked at what the mitigation potential is and looked at it at different price points. So you can see that in agriculture, especially look at nutrient management, a lot of those benefits can occur at a pretty low carbon price point because, again, they're beneficial and profitable for the grower. And then I just do need to add, even though I am talking about working lands and what can happen in row crops, avoided conversion is almost always our best bet in terms of how nature can be part of the climate solution. So what's not differentiated here is that some of these opportunities are actually reduced emissions. For example, nutrient management is avoiding emissions that are currently happening in agriculture. But one of the benefits of soil health and accruing carbon in the soil is that that's actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And right now, nature is really, and kind of natural systems are the most, I would say, socially acceptable way of actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere, which is going to be a critical part of reaching the 1.5 degree goal. So we did a literature review based analysis of what the co-benefits are of some of these practices. So this is just looking at soil health. This is, again, not something that can be scaled down to a field in any way, but this is looking at the impacts of putting in cover crops and reducing tillage and what those benefits are in terms of climate mitigation. 25 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions could be mitigated, could actually be sequestered per year. We reduce nutrient loss to the environment, which is one of the major causes of water quality concerns. We also avoid soil erosion, which again has benefits in terms of water quality and farm productivity. And we can even increase water holding capacity, which by itself doesn't seem that exciting, but when you put it together with what Bidisha just told us of what rural communities are actually most concerned about, this is probably one of the most important co-benefits and the one that we need to be able to talk about and quantify better in order to really resonate with rural communities, even though it's the one that feels farthest from our climate goals.
And these numbers are for U.S.?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is if you had row crop acres in the U.S.
Okay,
yeah.
good.
So when you look at those are all kind of the environmental co-benefits. These are the benefits for the grower. So when they think about why they're improving their soil health, I know a couple of farmers who would say, and it's cool because, I want to leave my farm and the world better for my kids and I'm helping address climate change. But most of them are going to talk about these other benefits on their farm, which is storing more carbon, which increases their fertility. There is no one single measure of soil health, the same way there is no one single measure of human health, but the best proxy we have happens to be something that we can all connect with in the climate world, which is carbon. The second, again, is absorbing more water, and it's making those farms more resilient in a dry year and in a wet year. And what we're seeing increasingly, at least in kind of the eastern Midwest, is that this is really important for storing the water when it comes down in massive amounts in the spring, and then holding that water when it's not coming later in the growing season, later in the summer. So this water element is really critical. It also helps improve water quality, which again is probably the biggest environmental concern that we're hearing in the Midwest, both in terms of people's connection to it. Everyone does feel the need to have clean water to drink, but also farmers feeling of their kind of license to operate. Water quality has much longer been a concern that they've had with their communities and what they're hearing from their neighbors when they go to the coffee shop than climate change. And just one element, I should have put these numbers in, but didn't. So Bidisha talked about the massive flooding that occurred in 2019, and we did a, not yet statistically sound, but an initial look at the counties that had been had more years of soil health practices over the past few years, and then their ability to actually go out and plant their crops last year. And we found that counties that had more acres of soil health practices for more years were actually able to plant at higher rates last year. So this is truly accruing in a material way that these practices can help farmers as we see probably what are going to be long-term changes in Midwest weather patterns. Last year felt like it was certainly very hard, and it felt like it was different, but all the indications from climatologists is that that's probably what it's going to look like for the foreseeable future. So if you put kind of, again, this is a literature review-based number, but if you put together what the benefits are both for society in terms of the environmental outcomes, as well as for growers in terms of their profitability, if soil health practices were adopted on kind of all row crop acres in the US, it could deliver nearly $50 billion in benefits to both the growers and to our society. So people are starting to value that and understand that. So I just want to talk a little bit about what we're doing and what we're seeing kind of out in the agriculture sector today. So there's voluntary action, there's an increasing number of corporate goals, and there's increasing desire to figure out how we can create a market for these outcomes. So I'm just going to speak briefly about each of them and then wrap up. So voluntary action, again, because a lot of growers are seeing the benefits of these practices to their operations in terms of reduced cost, additional management options, resilience because of healthier soils. A lot of growers are taking these actions on their own or using, long-standing government cost share programs to do that. We've seen a threefold increase in the use of cover crops from 2015 to 2018. And we measured that using satellite imagery. For our certification, again, this is around nutrient management. It's a little bit cheating to say it's 4 Rs because the word right begins with all of them. So it's like the right type of fertilizer, the right timing, the right place, the right amount. So, but this is growing, and there are fertilizer sales operations that are becoming certified to say, we are following these practices. So, work with us because we're going to give you fertilizer recommendations. And in a lot of places, it's actually those same companies apply the fertilizer. We're going to do it in a way that follows these best practices. But this is still not enough. The Nature Conservancy's goal is to see 50% of row crops under soil health management practices by 2025. And we're at about 10% today, so we have a long way to go. So voluntary action is helpful, but it's not enough. So we've seen more and more companies in the food supply chain making commitments towards soil health, towards greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and improve sustainability of their supply chains. So here's just one example from General Mills. They have done a lot. They're one of our funders. And in 2016, they did an analysis of how they would meet greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals that they had created. And they looked at their supply chain. They thought, okay, well, we'll change packaging on cereals, we'll change transportation, we'll do all this stuff that we can control, energy efficiency in our production facilities. And they realized that they just absolutely could not get to their goal if they didn't also look at how the grain going into their system was grown. So this really turned them on to soil health and the opportunity for both carbon sequestration, reduced emissions, and improved resilience in their systems, and the importance of changing how these crops are actually grown. They've also committed to significant acreage goals in terms of they've actually bought some land, which is pretty unique. They're actually becoming a little more vertically integrated, and then also empowering the growers who produce the food that goes into their products. And this is one of many examples, and I can go into others if you guys want, but I'll also go into kind of the complexity of this later on. But there's increasing desire from the supply chain to work on this issue. So I'm going to wrap up with ecosystem service markets. Not new to any of us. I would say when a couple years ago, groups were reconvening around the potential for farmers to be part of ecosystem service markets, and they invited the Nature Conservancy to be part of that conversation. We were a little skeptical. We've been trying to monetize ecosystem services for decades. Most of us have been. There's a lot of barriers, but there's also a reason why we've been trying to do it for so long. The opportunity for scale, the opportunity to actually get benefits down to the grower level, the ability to kind of advance the science and how scientific advancements over the past few years have actually made it easier for agriculture and efficiency in the system. So there's a lot of reasons to try this, even though at the end of the day, if there's no demand for these services, there's probably not going to be a market.
Just to jump in real quick, because if someone walked in off the street, again, you're in a town that doesn't
Sorry.
look at ag. What do you mean when you say ecosystem services for ag? Just
Yeah, so it could be the climate mitigation outcome or water quality or even in some cases water quantity.
so
Benefits.
compensating, that farmers could get compensated for providing these kind of services
Yep.
that aren't, yeah. I was like making sure because it's a,
Yes,
again,
thank you.
It's not talked about a lot here in DC. Well,
Right. Right. Carbon markets are, right?
Carbon
And
markets is the
so
way to think of it.
essentially
Good.
this is how agriculture could be part of a carbon market.
okay.
Water also increasingly important in terms of water quality. So there could be water quality trading markets that, again, we've been trying in the US for many years. And then water quantity is increasingly an issue, both in terms of how agriculture can hold water upstream in flooding events, and then in the West more in terms of reducing water inputs in agriculture to have more water availability to cities.
Good. Thanks.
Yeah. So Badisha's report had, a lot more money than this going back to rural systems. This is just a back of the envelope. If Midwestern farmers were paid $10 per ton of carbon and they were putting in cover crops, this could be $160 million back into their pockets each year if that's what they got paid. So look at the CAP report for all the details, but that's something I use in a lot of other more farmer-oriented talks that gets them a little excited, because this is real money. The way I put it is that every year, a farmer, when they harvest their grain, they know there's a market out there to buy it, but they're also producing all these other goods. They're sequestering carbon, they're improving water quality depending on their practices, and right now there's nowhere for them to sell it. So it should be as easy as selling their grain.
So $10 of carbon or carbon dioxide, please.
Of carbon. Oh, that was, let me look at the
Can I ask
calculations I
questions
have in
about
my.
the microphone.
Very quick.
Yeah.
Clarification.
Can you restate the?
That was,
restate the
he
question?
asked whether it was carbon or carbon dioxide, and that is a good question. I will look at these numbers I have, but
That's okay.
I think it's
yeah.
carbon dioxide, isn't it?
carbon.
I don't know which
I know. Okay.
numbers you're looking at.
Okay. I think it's just carbon.
Okay. Thank
That's a good question. So we're part of the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium that is trying to create this market. This is a kind of multi-stakeholder group that's trying to address both the kind of technical barriers that there are to these opportunities, as well as generating that demand. And this group is setting up pilots this year and hoping to launch the markets in 2022. And I'm excited about this because, again, partially it's trying to overcome these barriers of, farmers in the U.S. have been told they could be part of getting paid for carbon since the Chicago Climate Exchange days in the 90s, and it's never worked. They've been burned many, many times, and like so many other industries, agriculture has a very, very long memory. So you can still talk to farmers who are like, yeah, you told me that in the 90s, like, why is it any different? But I do think people are learning a lot more from what we have in the past. We're trying not to get out ahead of ourselves so that we're promising something we can't deliver. But I think this is also kind of creating the conversation to talk about how agriculture, again, can be part of the solution and could be integrated into a larger part of climate action and climate policy in the U.S. So just a brief look ahead on some of the challenges, but also how we can address some of those. So this is just my wow, that's too complicated slide. That's just the point of this. But the point is that the agriculture supply chain is incredibly complex. Even companies like General Mills, even companies like Cargill and ADM that are buying the grain to then turn around and sell to food companies don't always know where things are coming from. And then as we start to talk about ecosystem services markets, there's a lot of different actors that think, like new market, how am I going to benefit from this? And I would say what we want is that the benefit ultimately goes to the grower. We are excited that some recent technologies are reducing the cost of, for example, verifying carbon, so that all that money isn't then spent on some of these other actors who are verifying rather than actually producing the result. But figuring out how to make all of this work, how to account for the benefits that growers are creating from their improved practices without infringing on their privacy is extremely complicated. So in 2016, we put out what we called a Rethink Soils Roadmap. It had to have a catchy name. But this is essentially what we see as the 10 kind of fundamental elements that need to be addressed to truly get to scale in terms of adopting soil health management practices. These buckets are in science and research, kind of economics and markets, and in policy. And we've been working ourselves on some of these issues, a lot of our partners on others over the past few years. There's been advancements, but we really think this roadmap still really holds in terms of what we need to address as a community. I would say now, looking back 3 years later, we would probably have added a bucket kind of on social factors and some of those pieces that are kind of harder to grasp onto, but equally as important in terms of why people adopt change, right? So you could take lessons from all kinds of other sectors to try to figure that out. I would say something that's really exciting is our Chinese colleagues just had this translated to Chinese in the past few months. So
And we will get the link to both the English and the Chinese one, and we'll put it on our website, tweet it out, Facebook it out, hand it to random people in the street. Yes.
Yeah, and so some of our key partners in this work are Soil Health Institute and Soil Health Partnership. I could explain who they are if necessary, but the point is they work on soil health, and we do a lot of communications together with them in the U.S. And again, our TNC China colleagues are translating their research and their products as well into Chinese to kind of get the same momentum in China around soil health. So really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much. And now in the audience, when you guys RSVP'd to come here, how many of you thought, I'm going to talk about dirt? Put your hand up. 2 people said that we were going to get dirty. All right. So I'm going to switch into your PowerPoint. So why don't you introduce yourself and
Okay.
but you have to be in a microphone because we're on webcasting.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for your invitation and also for the introduction. Well, as Jennifer said, I will talk mostly two things. Firstly, is about Chinese clean energy development and with our support, and secondly about rural electrification in China. But I think I need to add one more point, a little bit more point about talking about GEF.
Your clicker.
Okay, this is related to other 2 topics as well. So let me start. First point, GEF.
Talking to the microphone.
Okay.
It's webcast.
Okay, the Global Environmental Facility, or briefly the GEF. So the GEF is a financial mechanism for a number of multilateral global environment conventions. For example, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, is one of the conventions. So we provide fundings to the developing country parties like China, India, for their project development, program development, so that these countries can achieve or fulfill their commitments to the conventions. That's where we are. So over the past 28 years, the GEF has provided more than $20 billion of cash or grant to more than 170 countries worldwide, and mobilized more than $100 billion as a co-financing worldwide for this project and programs. In China, for example, particularly, we provided roughly a little bit more than $2 billion cash to the Chinese government and Chinese people, and mobilized $21 billion as a co-finance, and we financed 215 projects in there. So this is what we do worldwide. This is the first point, brief introduction about the GEF. Now, let's move to the second point, China. Why we are talking about China? Why the GF supports China? Why does the US government support China? I have two reasons, at least. First, China is a developing country party under conventions, and the US is a developed country party in the conventions. So the US or the GF has obligation to support China in global environment condition or environment improvement. Is the first reason. The second reason is that China is not efficient in terms of natural resources use. For example, in 2018, China provided homes for, I think, 1.3 plus billion people, roughly 18.5% of the worldwide population. China only provided 15.4% of the worldwide GDP in 2018. More importantly, China emitted about 30% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see the three numbers. You can see China is not efficient in terms of natural resource and energy use. That's why we should support China. Okay. Now, let's go a little bit deeper about the greenhouse gas emissions in China. Last year, China emitted more than 10 gigatons, 10 billion tons, more than that, of carbon dioxide emissions, roughly about 30% of the worldwide total. This is a huge amount. Compared with the Chinese emission in 2005, it's dramatically increased by 80% in 14 years. If China keeps this momentum of greenhouse gas emissions, by 2030, Chinese emissions will reach more than 16 billion tons, gigatons. You may not have any idea how much that is. Today, the worldwide emitted about 32 billion tons. So by that time, China will emit more than half or 50% of the total emissions today. That's the business as usual. If we don't do anything, or China does not do anything, that will happen. But fortunately, the Chinese government realized that this is not feasible. This is not acceptable, not only by the US or other countries' government, but also by the Chinese government as well. In its nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, to the Paris Agreement, the Chinese government promised or pledged three things. First, to cap total carbon emissions before 2030. This is very, very good. Second, to enlarge non-fossil fuel consumption, the share of non-fossil fuel consumption up to or beyond 20% by 2030. Third, to cut down carbon emission intensity by 60 to 65% in the period of 2005 and 2030, in this period. If these three measures are achieved, the targets are achieved, China will emit roughly about 12 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions by 2030. So you can see the gap between the business as usual and between the nationally determined contribution scenario by the Chinese government. There is a gap of like 4.1 gigatons. So that's why we need to do more work in China. So the Chinese people and the government has done a lot. let me quickly go through about what they have done, what we have supported in China. We supported China in energy efficiency, including energy efficiency lighting, energy efficiency buildings, appliances, and waste to power generation. We helped China to get the technologies from Caterpillar company to produce power from coal and methane. It's kind of waste of the power generation. And we helped China to develop energy efficiency motors, industrial boilers, and good transportation, including fuel cell vehicle development, electrical vehicle development. And we are doing something. We are helping China now, right now, happening in China to do the third wave of rural electrification. We are going to phase out all the fossil fuel consumption in rural community in China from now to 2030. I will talk about this a little bit more later. And our colleague talked about the total emissions for by the U.S. Agriculture, like tens of million tons of carbon dioxide or hundreds of million tons of carbon dioxide. Now we are talking about a billion gigatons carbon emission reduction in China, China's rural air. So I don't have time to talk about every project, but here I want to mention with a little bit more moments to talk about one program in China. That's the China Renewable Energy Scale-Up Program. This program is called, in brief, it's a CRISP. If you type CRISP in Google, you can see tons of information about this. This is a very successful program. In this program, the GEF provided a total of $67 million cash to China. And the World Bank provided $632 million of a loan to China in 14 years in two phases. What we did was to help the Chinese government to have a new policy, like a feed-in tariff system policy for China to incentivize the private sector to invest in renewable energy. We provided training to the Chinese government and industry stakeholders to do this kind of efficiency improvement and quality improvement for their production of equipment for the renewable energy, so that the Chinese equipment is like wind power, solar PV, and biomass power and small power plants generation equipment can reach the international level in terms of quality level. Because of that, proudly, we have helped China to reduce carbon intensity from 2005 to 2008 in this period by 46%. Carbon intensity reduced by 46%. This is equivalent to more than 5 billion tons of carbon dioxide reduction. Because of that, China now is leading the worldwide in solar PV and wind farm development. Today, if you divide the worldwide total solar PV production capacity into three parts, the first part will be all located in China. The second part will be located in Japan and US jointly. And the third part will be scattered in other countries worldwide. You can see this kind of situation. And China will continue leading this production and installation in solar PV as well. In wind power, same thing. Wind power is even better. Even today, China has more than 33%, more than 1/3 of this total installation worldwide. So I don't want to take more time to do this. I want to switch to my next talking point. Sorry. I take this. I like your tea. Sorry.
You like my tea? Okay,
I
good.
like your tea. This is a wonderful Chinese tea. Thank you. Here, I put it here. Okay. So the third point is about the third wave of rural electrification in China. Why a third wave? What is the first wave and the second wave? Let me explain. China started its rural electrification over 30 years ago. At that time, in 1990, China had a total population of rural population for 800 million people. 800, remember, we have 800 million people. And out of these people, 390 million could not access electricity. Huge amount. This number of people is more than what we have in the US and Canada summed together. So this amount of people, very poor people. How can we help them? The government of China had a very good idea. We need to end the poverty of China. We need to electrify these people first. So they did a good job. So they had two waves to do this, two phases, or I call them waves. Their first wave started from 1990. And the Chinese government used two strategies or two approaches. The first was to massively expand its existing power transmission distribution network in cities and urban area, just expansion, so that the urban can help the rural areas. That is the cheapest way to do this rural electrification. In the meantime, the Chinese installed a large number of coal-fired power plants, dirty power plants, oil, coal. At that time, natural gas not available. Because of that, 80% of these 390 million people got electricity after 10 years. That's the first approach. The second approach was for the remote people. They are not close to the urban area. So the government encouraged the local people, local government to open coal mines, small coal mines, install small coal power plants, or available small hydropower, and build a regional and small network to electrify these people. So together, these two approaches together electrified 97% of the population who could not access electricity. Only 3 people were waiting there for the government policy because they were too far away. They live in too spacious area. They could not. It's not economically or financially viable to electrify these people by power expansion or build power plant. So now the government started the second wave of rural electrification, starting from 2011 to 2015, to electrify this 11.7 million people, very difficult people. These people did not have money. The government put the funding for this to install solar PV and wind power, small one for individual families. So after a few years, by October 2015, you look at this time, the last village in Sichuan province in remote area received electricity. So by that time, China finished its rural electrification.
Pretty impressive.
Now, you may ask me why we needed the third wave of rural electrification. Third wave, why? Now, this is the reason. Today, China has a total number of people, 573 million people still living in the rural area. They consume about 590 million tons of coal each year. These guys emit 1.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide each year. Huge amount. If we do not do anything, these people will move to urban and they will expand their energy consumption. Urban area, one urban person will consume 3 times more than this rural person. So if we do not do anything, this kind of energy consumption, carbon emission will triple, definitely. So we need to do something to achieve this carbon emission reduction. So the government of China realized this. Before, as Jennifer said, the government did not do very much about this. They forgot this. But now they are going to do something. What shall we do? So we have already one project in China. The GF provided $10 million to do demonstration, to do policy improvement, to show in 115 villages and 3 towns, small towns in the poor area of China, in the west and the northwest, this area to show the zero carbon emission initiative for these villages. Basically, we'll do biogas generation to replace the natural gas. We will use solar PV, roof solar PV, and small wind power to replace this fossil fuel generated power in there. So this is our strategy.
Mhm.
So I don't know if we have time to show this video or not. I don't.
We can't
Okay.
show it because
Okay.
it's YouTube and this is
Thank you.
podcast, sorry.
Thank you.
But yeah.
So anyway, so I believe after 10 years, you can see this GF initiative will effectively reduce at least 1.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide from rural area to fill the gap of the two scenarios I showed in the page number 5 between the business as usual of Chinese emission reduction and the government pledged nationally determined contribution scenario. So in that gap, we need to do something to reduce 4.1 gigatons. And the rural people can contribute 1.5 gigatons. That's why we're doing that job. So before ending my presentation, I want to quote the two most famous people's words. The first person was Chairman Mao Zedong. I think you know this guy very well. Mr. Chairman Mao is the founder of the People's Republic of China. And he had a lot of good things, good words. I quote one word here. In Chinese, it's called 待到山花烂漫时，他在丛中笑. There are tons of translation or interpretation for what he said in here. But here is my interpretation. When China's renewable energy production and utilization are blossoming in China or even worldwide, the GF is smiling in the green, blue bushes of the worldwide. That means the GF catalyzed the development of renewable energy, but we do not claim the credit. Owners are due to the government of China and the Chinese people. This is the first thing. Second, Mr. Deng Xiaoping, he is, from my mind, he is the greatest leadership in modern China. He opened the door of China to the West. Without him, China would not have been today. And he wrote these words, 摸着石头过河. Worldwide words translation means crossing the river by touching or feeling stones on the ground. Again, this is my interpretation again. When China is moving forward in new directions, like energy or climate change exploration or like carbon emission reduction or rural electrification, this kind of new directions, China needs to feel the way by touching something and then to deal with uncertainties or any risk forward. Proudly, the GF has served very tangible stones and stands for China when China was moving forward. And the GF will continue serving this. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. So we've talked about buckets, and now we have GF hiding in the bushes. GF Stone hiding in the bushes. Now this is great, but so I liked how you set the agenda, that thinking about if we're going to talk about, rural China is going to continue to have a growing carbon footprint, and the success from urban can translate to rural. All right, hold your questions for him there. We're going to switch over and dive deeper. Now Karen also plays a cool role. She's going to talk about both U.S. and mainly China, but also U.S. and China in terms of carbon, methane capture. All right. You start your intro and I'll get your slides up.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer, for giving me this opportunity. I always enjoy the opportunity to talk about rural China. So, you ready?
Wow,
All right.
you have a Chinese name. Excellent.
我喜欢我的名字.
你叫什么名字?
Yeah. I like my name, so Makarin. So I'm going to be talking about capturing greenhouse gases in the countryside, both in China and in the United States.
Other way. The other button. There you go.
Your button. Okay, so when we look at the breakdown of greenhouse gases that are emitted in the United States, we've been talking a lot about CO2, but second to CO2, second to carbon dioxide, is methane. And methane is a particularly important greenhouse gas because it's 30 times stronger in terms of its climate impact than carbon dioxide. So if you can mitigate methane, it can have a very big impact. So China's makeup is very similar, but a little bit more methane. So what I want to concentrate on our discussion today is how can we reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the countryside by capturing and mitigating methane. So as I said, methane is 30 times stronger. So it's a real opportunity to with small effort to have a big impact. So before I go charging ahead and talking about methane in terms of policy, let's review a little bit about methane. And this will be a little methane 101. So methane is natural gas. And sometimes it's called biogas in this particular situation. And it's formed through a two-step process. So the first step is without the presence of oxygen, with no oxygen, organic matter like manure from animals is broken down by acid-forming bacteria to create organic acids. And one of the things that you get to know about organic acids when you work in this field is they smell really bad. So if you want to think about how decomposing sewage or manure smells, the reason why it smells so bad is because of these organic acids. Now there's a second step, and so there's another group of microbes that will take organic acids and break those down to methane, which I said is natural gas. So let's look at these microbes a little bit closer. So what about these acid-forming bacteria? One of the things that we've learned about these acid-forming bacteria is that they're pretty tough. They will work over a wide range of pHs, salt contents, and temperatures. So they will work over a wide range of environmental conditions. So because they're so tough, I like to think of them as like Buckeyes, okay?
Ohio State University mascot, if you don't know.
Yeah. Okay, so what about the other step? What about those methane-forming bacteria? What are they like? Well, they're a little more sensitive. They're a little more delicate. They don't like high salt content. They don't like low pH. They don't like cold temperatures. So they're more like gators, okay? So they're a little bit more sensitive. So these methane formers, they like it to be warm. They like to have a near neutral pH. They like to have a low salt content. So what happens if it gets too cold? The gators are snoozing. They're not dead. They're just not working. So we really have to be careful when we are making methane to make sure that we're satisfying these methane formers. So in China, right now there's about over 4 million livestock units producing a lot of manure. So if you were to spread this manure on the surface of the ground, which is a really good thing to do to recycle it, it will be giving off methane as this two-step process goes on in nature. So methane will be released from this manure. So how could we maybe keep that from happening? Well, one question that I get a lot is, well, can't we just treat that manure like we treat sewage? You know, we have sewage treatment plants to treat human waste. Why can't we treat animal waste the same way? And that's a good question. So is there another treatment option? Well, the other treatment option would be an aerobic process that uses oxygen with oxygen. And this process is a one-step process where we have our organic matter and we have another group of microbes, and we call those heterotrophic microbes, heterotrophic bacteria, and they go straight to carbon dioxide. So they skip methane altogether. So there's no methane generated at all. So what are these microbes like? You know, heterotroph, that's like a $5 word. So when we think about these microbes, another way to think about them is they're kind of like Scrooge McDuck. They're very greedy. These microbes are hungry for oxygen and will use up all the oxygen that you provide for them. So if you build a wastewater treatment plant to treat this kind of high-strength waste, and here's a picture of one that's actually in China. So here's a aerobic process that's trying to treat this waste. You have to build all this infrastructure, provide lots of motors and aerators in order to get lots of air in there. So it's a very high electrical demand. So if you choose this option, what does that mean? That means you are now on the electric company's Christmas card list. You're probably one of their best customers. So this is an option that's very high cost and demands a lot of energy. Where if we went with this anaerobic digestion route, we don't have to input all that energy, and in fact, we get energy out in the form of natural gas, in the form of methane. So that's why this particular approach is so attractive. Okay, so that's methane 101. So how do we do this? How do we capture methane? Well, what we do is we build a tank. So here's a tank that we put the manure in and allow it to digest inside that tank, and then we tap into it and draw that natural gas off and bring it into the home, in this particular case, to run a stove. Or we can draw that gas off in order to put it to use. So what are some of the policies that we would need to adopt to enable effective methane capture? So what are some of the policies? Research, demonstration, training, subsidies are the types of things that make policy. So I'd like to talk about those with you all. So when did the policies related to anaerobic digestion and methane capture start in the United States? They started in 1979, and there might be a couple of us in the audience that remember the 70s. I remember the 70s. And what happened in 1979? That was the oil embargo. And fuel prices shot up. So I drew a line, a vertical line, a little blue line at 1979, right as those fuel prices are just skyrocketing. So all of a sudden, there was all kinds of interest in alternative energy, and it's like, whoa, maybe we should try to tap into this methane thing. So guess what? All kinds of research started up, right after that. It took a little while to get it up and going, and digesters built and data collected and papers written. So by the mid-'80s, all of a sudden we saw these journal articles coming out of these scientists that were studying, methane. And it increased, and then it peaked about 86, and then it went down to 0. So by the end of the 80s, there was nothing being published, nothing being talked about in terms of anaerobic digestion. It was this flash in the pan, because oil prices went up, but then what happened? They went back down again. And as soon as they went back down again, there was no interest. So I was a part of this. I worked in one of those labs. And then all of a sudden, it just kind of disappeared. Nobody talked about it at all. Well, what happened in China at the same time? So what happened in China at the same time was the interest there and the emphasis there was not on fuel prices so much. It was on replacing wood and charcoal for cooking in the countryside. So how could we, provide fuel so that the peasants could cook their 3 meals a day, and could biogas fuel those cook stoves so that they wouldn't have to gather firewood and they wouldn't have to burn coal? Because the energy makeup at that time was mostly coal, and then they were burning straw, and they were also collecting firewood and burning firewood, and this was devastating to the forests in China. So that was really a big driver, was how can we stop this collection of firewood, because it was really devastating to the forests. So in 1979, the same time, China also invested in research, and the Ministry of Agriculture established the Biogas Institute. And the Biogas Institute is still in Chengdu. It's still there. And it opened in 1979. And they started out by assisting and developing demonstration projects, and 7 million biogas digesters were built. So between, the 79 when they were established up to about 83 or so, they built these 7 million digesters in China, in rural China. So what happened in the 80s? As I said, in the 80s, all that effort that was started in the early 80s, 85% of those bioreactors were shut down. And in China, after they built those 7 million, about 30% of them were either abandoned or unutilized. Why was this? Well, why was it in the United States? It was because of low oil prices. As soon as the oil prices went back down, nobody was interested in anaerobic digestion, so they just shut those systems down. Why were they not utilized in China? Well, in some cases, they didn't have enough biogas for their 3 meals a day. And often it was because they didn't have enough feedstock. They built the digester, but that's not magical. You still have to feed it. You still have to put manure in it. And if they didn't have enough feedstock, even though they had a digester, it was underutilized or they just stopped using it. So in 2006, with the new renewable energy law, China has set a new goal of 40 million digesters. 40 million digesters by 2010. So guess what? They did it. By 2010, they built 40 million household digesters all throughout China. So these digesters also were not restricted to just these small household digesters. By 2012, there were thousands of small, medium, and large digesters built on some of the farms, the larger farms that were all throughout China. Well, what about the United States? Interest in anaerobic digestion and biogas digesters has come back around again in the United States. And in about 2000, the Ag Star program was started in the United States. And that's a joint effort between the U.S. Department of Agriculture and U.S. EPA. And the Department of Agriculture provided funding for over 100 projects. And US EPA, their primary role is in supporting and promoting and efforts to reduce methane emissions. So what we find in the United States is we have a whopping 254 digesters now from this program versus, 40 million in China. So what other things does the Biogas Institute do? Well, one of the things that they recognized, especially after that first wave of building the digesters, is that they needed training. People need to know how to operate them. People need to know how to build them. So they started a training program in 1981, and they called it the Asia Pacific Training Program because they saw their role not only teaching their own artisans in China, but also in the whole region. So they have already, by 2018, reached out to 55 other countries in terms of teaching them. And this is way before Belt and Road, where they had this image that they wanted to be a regional leader, not just dealing with the needs in China. Now, in terms of subsidies, in order to make it to 40 million, they did provide a subsidy, and the subsidy went into effect in 2011. And the subsidy is between 1,300 and 3,500 renminbi, which is about half of the cost of building the system for an individual household. And the differential is in the West, where there's more poverty, they get a higher subsidy. In the East, where it's richer, they get a lower subsidy. So this is the investments that were added onto that graph, and you can see the investment in the subsidy mirrors the rise to the 40 million digesters. So, but if you make this commitment to get the subsidy, you can't just build the digester. You have to build the whole package, and the whole package includes improving the livestock pen, so the cow room, the pig room that's in the home, has to be improved. They have to install a modern toilet, and that toilet is actually plumbed right into the digester. And they have to improve their kitchen so that the biogas then goes into the kitchen as used for cooking and for lighting. So one of the big benefits of this to the countryside is the indoor air quality, especially for women. When you go into these kitchens where they're burning charcoal, it's pretty awful. And now going into these kitchens, when I'm in the countryside and I'm in the kitchens where they're using biogas, is so clean. And it really, really improves women's lives. Now, the other benefit of this anaerobic digestion is that it also treats the waste. So in these small livestock operations, this one has just a farrowing operation with a few sows, and their waste flows into this anaerobic digester. And when you digest animal waste, you reduce its odor because that methane doesn't have any odor, and after you treat that waste, it greatly reduces the odor. It reduces the pathogens, which improves the health in the countryside, and it reduces its volume. So you're hauling less of it to the field. But the miracle thing of it all is that you still retain the nutrients. The nutrients are still in the waste. They are not compromised by this treatment process. So, looking at the cost benefits, biogas is not a pure gas. It has some impurities in it, and if you want to burn it to make electricity, you have to clean it first, or you'll damage your equipment. So there's extra cost if you're going to generate electricity with it. So the cost of anaerobic digestion is greater than the value of the fuel. So this is why in the United States it's a hard sell. Because if you're only looking at, you're going to get this fuel value from it, but it costs more to make it than what you get out of it. But if you start adding in all of these other benefits, the greenhouse gas reductions, the value of the waste treatment, the improved air quality, the forest protection, and the value of the gas, can we flip that sign to the cost of digestion being less than all of those multiple values? So the goal was 3 meals, producing enough biogas for 3 meals a day. Now in Sichuan, where I have that star, that's where the Biogas Institute is. And yes, they can accomplish that. You can build a household digester, and from the waste generated by the animals raised by one family, you can produce enough biogas to cook 3 meals a day. And if you multiply that times 40 million, that's equaling the amount of carbon dioxide that would be generated by burning 28 billion gallons of gasoline. So that's a real number. But what happens when you go north? What if you go up to, say, Shandong province, which has a lot of livestock? You're not able to produce year-round enough biogas to cook 3 meals a day. So now it's not nearly as attractive. Now, why is that? Why can't they produce enough biogas for 3 meals a day year-round? Well, remember my methane formers. It's colder when you get farther north in China, and they need those warm temperatures. So what happens is that my tough acid formers that are like buckeyes, they can get ahead of those lazy, snoozing methane formers, and now my bioreactor will get off balance. So what will happen is in the wintertime is that the methane formers are not keeping up with the acid formers, so those digesters start to smell really bad, which isn't very pleasant, and you're not getting any natural gas. Now, what happens when the weather warms up? Will the system start working again right away? Not really, because those acid formers are making what? Acid. They're dropping the pH. And guess what? My methane formers don't like low pH either. So you do have to maintain these systems and bring them out of the winter. And that's part of the training that you need to have as a operator of these systems. So you have to know how to deal with a cold spell and to guard against your digester. And in this case, we would say it goes sour because the acid formers get ahead of the methane formers. So a lot of the research that's going up in Shandong province, which is where I work when I work in rural China, is on cold weather. So they're experimenting with building, solar heaters on top of their digesters and running hot water, heat exchange through these small digesters. They're looking at insulation and insulating the digesters. Is that enough? They're building them inside of greenhouses. There's a lot of greenhouses in Shandong province. And so they put digesters inside the greenhouses because it's a warmer environment. So that's some of the research that's going on at the Shandong Academy of Agricultural Sciences. But research is also going on, and it's going on worldwide. That little blip that we had in the 80s is, you hardly see it now when you expand it into what's going on now. So there's research going on in the United States and in China and in other parts of the world. So capturing methane in agriculture, it's a sensitive process. It's sensitive to temperature. And if you just consider the value of the fuel, it's just not enough. So in order to have a successful program in promoting the something like biogas capture and methane capture, is the program needs to be consistent, like it was in China from 1979, and they didn't stop. It needs to be comprehensive. It has to be more than just throwing some money at building things. You have to also have training. You also have to have other kinds of support. And you need to be able to focus in on the multiple benefits, not just the fuel value. So we can learn a lot from rural China, and there's lots of opportunities for technology transfer. So we can go to China or bring those scientists here so that we can learn more about their success. 谢谢大家.
Thank you. Yay. So come on back, Karen, and you come on up, Mingwang. So yeah, so we did like macro looks from Badisha and Mingwang, and then did a little deeper dive into both dirt and poop. But that's good. So I think we've given you enough information to be slightly dangerous. I can ask questions, but I think I'd like to see if we get you guys kind of, let's see what they're. So they're not the sleeping gators, but they're the aggressive buckeye.
That's right.
Okay. So how about Enan? Can you just, did you have it on? Just test it first. Just say hello. There we go. And please say your name and affiliation. Would be great to know too.
You bet. John Wheeler, Rising Tide Solutions. We're putting together a consortium to build local economic development and diversification hubs in some of these areas. Thank you, elbow bump for everybody. Great presentations. But my question is more around the U.S. We talked a lot about policy and your examples, General Mills, and there's some other large players like Indigo Ag doing Terraton Initiative. Are there roles or opportunities for the private sector to get more plugged in to help drive this forward and pick up some of those policy initiatives?
That's a PIPA question.
Yeah, and do you want us to just take each question?
Take this one right now, and then I'll gather a couple.
You
Go
can
ahead, you
add
should
too.
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, right now it's basically all being driven by the private sector, all the interest. I think our biggest challenge to really, catalyzing the interest in the private sector is that a lot of the practices I was talking about, I mean, there's other work that needs to be done in rural areas, both in terms of agriculture and its role in improving water quality and addressing climate change that I didn't talk about. Those are a little harder to start with because there's not a profitability angle. So we're starting kind of with row crops and production because at the end of the day, you could see that for a lot of growers, maybe 3 years, 7 years down the line, these practices pay for themselves in terms of either improved resilience or reduced input costs. But we actually don't know kind of what that gap is. So it's hard to build the bridge to get over it. So we don't know if it's 3 years or if it's 7 years. Land tenure, which is not a term we use often in the United States, is a major issue because over half the farmland in the U.S. is rented. In the Midwest, it's even higher. Mm-hmm. And most rental agreements, whether they're written or not, are annual, even though most farmers end up farming for more than 1 year on the same piece of land. They just don't have that certainty. So there's this, I think the private sector wants to help build that bridge. We've seen through government cost share, cost share is not the answer. We can't perpetually be paying for these practices forever. But what a lot of the companies turn to us for is, who and how long and how much do we need to pay? And we're working on that. So, yes, I think all the interest right now is coming from the private sector, but I don't think we have the right information right now to really catalyze everything that we could. You want to add anything?
Okay, and I'll be jumping in, but how about the woman here in the middle and then the gentleman in the front row? She's on this side. Teresa's on this side. Thanks.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'm Tara from CET Academic Programs. I think this is a question both for Pipa and Badisha. In one of your slides, biochar was pretty high on the list of kind of mitigating factors, I believe, for soil. And I'm wondering, both in terms of soil remineralization efforts, rock dust and biochar. I'm from Vermont, and I know that there are some initiatives up there that have gotten a lot of traction. Are there kind of federal programs that are targeting this, or resources that those folks could tap into? And also, is this something that you're hearing about in your focus groups or listening sessions across the country? I know that actually this one small organization has gotten a lot of interest from China and folks wanting to use rock dust or other remineralization products. So both, are there federal resources available, and also is this something that you're seeing more broadly? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I can briefly explain what biochar is, if that's helpful. So, we got a really good lesson in how systems change when there's no oxygen. So similar, if you had a burning system in a limited oxygen environment, that's kind of how the very bottom of your fire, like the coals. So biochar is essentially you pyrolyze something with limited or no oxygen. And you end up with this really carbon-rich material. You can talk about federal programs probably better than I can, but I would say, we had it up there actually in our paper at a much lower number in terms of the mitigation benefit, because again, in theory, you take all this material and then end up with just the carbon, so you could avoid what happens when you have an aerobic kind of digestion of that material, which produces a lot of carbon dioxide. So you have all the carbon left. But right now, the way the infrastructure is set up in the U.S., there's just not a lot of material to go into the biochar process that is close enough to where you can actually do that process in a way that you're not then spending a lot of either money or greenhouse gas emissions transporting that around. So I think right now we still see it as kind of a limited opportunity, and one that is, hasn't gained a lot. I mean, I've been hearing about it for a decade. I think there are some local uses where it's really appropriate, but we don't see really big opportunities to scale it up in the U.S.
Yeah, on the federal program side, I would have to double check this, but as people said, there's not a ton of deployment right now, but generally these types of things would go through USDA's NRCS, and through programs such as, the EQIP program, for example, has like a menu of like hundreds of different practices that farmers can get different types of compensation for or incentives for, et cetera. So that's where I would suspect if it were there, but I don't know if it's there. And then in terms of more on the technical assistance side, that's where you would also see like the NRCS technical assistance folks or USDA extension. But like I said, I'm not sure, like, because of the fact that it's there's all these other issues with it that's actually happening.
I want to ask a question. I'm going to jump in. We'll get to you in a second. So one thing that I was struck with as I started doing research for after reading Badisha's report, and that I was struck with it, like in the United States, this rural climate action appears to be a bipartisan issue up on the Hill. I watched a couple of hearings. It's, scintillating, but it was actually really good. There were some really good speakers and, with farmers and talking about how they, like you said in your interviews, that they weren't always saying, they didn't always attribute it to climate change, but they were the kinds of problems you said listed. Do you think that, what do you see some kind of, maybe on the U.S. side, are you seeing some, and well, Karen can answer this too, some kind of action kind of coming from the federal government that, what's percolating up that we might want to look out for? And similarly in China, the GEF has been working with the National Development Reform Commission on rural climate action. And I want you to talk a little bit more about what that might look like. Is it going to be distributed renewables, et cetera? Or is it more than just renewables? Because you just talked about renewables. Okay. Was that a coherent enough question?
Sure, I can start. So I think yes. So the interesting thing politically here is that unlike some of the other sectors of the economy where you've seen interest in action, it's a lot from like a certain part of the political spectrum. Rural, lots of states are rural and they're blue and red and purple and all kinds of colors. So I think there's a big opportunity. I think there's still a fairly limited conversation around calling it rural climate action per se. I think the conversations are more around soil health, resilience, looking at weather patterns and how you can help rural communities cope with them better and prepare for them better, help farmers do that. And from my perspective, it's fine to not call it climate action. It's probably better for a lot of places because that has become so politicized for various reasons. But I think those are areas as we think about action on climate change as a coalition that would be required to take action. We don't necessarily see like climate action looking like a giant climate package that goes through Congress instead. I mean, for a variety of reasons, I don't think that's going to happen. What we do see is like kind of various pieces tackling different sectors happening at different times, depending on kind of what opportunities arise in the next Congress. Probably this Congress, even they're looking across the sectors, and there's the Select Committee in the House of Representatives is going to produce a report very soon that's going to be putting out across sector recommendations, including agriculture and rural, that are going to be talking about climate specifically. But I think when the political buy-in and the bipartisanship will come is coming when you talk more about those other things like resilience, soil health, water quality, et cetera.
Soil and water. I mean, water definitely, and I mean, but maybe just to add one, like for this, because you do dirt. Do you see kind of I'm going to do it, a groundswelling of support from different quarters? Because I think that, to really get to, because what you were proposing, like all of you are proposing, a more comprehensive look. And in each of these areas, like what?
So I mean, I would totally agree with what Badisha said. I think, and this also kind of relates to the private sector opportunity. A lot of what we're talking about is the fact that let's say even tomorrow there was a large price on carbon that farmers could access. Let's say $50 a ton. I don't know how many farmers out there could actually capitalize on that. So one of the policy pieces that we're really asking for, as we do see some bipartisan efforts coming down the pike, is like, this is great. We are super happy for anyone of any political affiliation to be thinking about how agriculture can be part of the solution. But we need, one of the biggest roles that policy and kind of public funding can play is helping give farmers the access, the technical assistance on practices, technical assistance on measurement to be able to access private markets that seem to be coming down the pike. So that's just the only addition I would make. And I think that, most of the farmers I talked to agree. So there was just a recent, new private carbon market that the largest farmer in Maryland just sold his carbon through. And he's great. He has a data person. He has a full-time data staff. And I'll talk to him like that's awesome. But like you are
not
a huge
common.
And he's like, yeah, totally. But I couldn't do it without him. So how do we reduce the barrier to entry there, so you don't have to farm 10,000 acres to be able to participate in something like that?
And Karen, so kind of along that lines, because you're at Ohio State, and I mean, so we were just talking a little bit more like the Fed, a little bit of the top down. In Ohio, I mean, is the state kind of helping to push things like the soil, getting the soil right, or anaerobic digestion? Is that the right level to kind of, because you do ag extension?
So the turning point in Ohio was in 2014 when on a August morning, my husband, who works for the Ohio Farm Bureau, his phone was blowing up because Toledo was their water was impacted by toxic algae, and their water supply was shut off. So
That's not a small city.
That was the big turning point in Ohio. So the algal bloom on Lake Erie drives everything. So all of the effort in Ohio toward cover crops, toward the four R's, toward everything is to help the agricultural community do what they can to improve the quality of Lake Erie, so that they are not regulated. So they're trying to do it on a voluntary basis. So the big stick is, if you guys don't figure this out, regulations are going to come in.
State,
that-
or do you think feds even?
No, it'll be feds. So that's, and Lake Erie, that's also with Canada. So this is a country that's on the border, or a lake that's on the border. So so those are that everything is driven in Ohio by that, and a lot of the Midwest is in the same situation.
And there's kind of like a Great Lakes Compact. I think I remember hearing that among the Great Lakes, which is Canada and U.S., that there were things done because it affected on both sides of the border, where you are starting to see some mitigation actions taken. So I don't know, just like groundswell of local action. Now so I asked you a question in terms of, because you were mainly focused on renewables. Give us a better sense of like what GEF with the Chinese government is going to focus on in the beginning. Is this mainly going to be, I mean, it's a big lift to get so many people in rural China off of coal. Are you going to is this going to be expanding the grid? Is it going to be more distributed renewables, energy efficiency? Tell me a little more.
Thank you. Well,
Microphone.
sorry. Thank you. Jennifer, I think the Chinese situation or policy historically or now very well. China is different from the U.S. Whenever the government wants to do something in China, you will do it, and the Chinese people will follow it.
Yeah, but it doesn't always work, because
let
for
me
many
tell you.
years,
Let me tell you.
Okay.
No, I'll give you an example. For example, I was in China in October last year, and I saw the people in there, they no longer burning in it's crops, the waste of crops in the field. I asked why. They said, the government had a policy to ban this kind of burning, open burning, for this waste of crops. If anyone does that, they've got a crop, caught and get a very heavy fine and maybe put in the jail. I mean, this is an example how China, will implement the policy. It's a very strict policy. Everyone should follow. In terms of this GF supporting in China, it's the third wave of rural electrification or zero carbon emission. This is what we're going to do. We are going to phase out all this kind of carbon-based energy in China, in rural area. As I mentioned, we will build up this kind of maybe decentralized network. I mean, power transmission, distribution network for the communities. We will use this renewable energy to replace this kind of grid of supply. This
So
energy.
solar, wind,
Yeah, with that.
and biogas?
Yeah, biogas will replace the natural gas. So we have this kind of two approaches like that. And I think at the very beginning, in the first 10 years, I don't think we can get rid of the power grid, support, because we needed the power, energy, electricity to support the communities. If this individual solar PV or wind power does not work in the evenings as a backup. So maybe after 10 years, when the battery technology is developing and cheaper, and then we can encourage people to install the batteries at home. That will really help the utility company as well. There is a wave like a dark wave. It's very, when it's kind of that kind of shape for the power grid. The power companies do not like renewable energy from rural or anywhere, because that will cost for the utility for power supply, because the power company needs to adjust their supply to adapt this kind of demand. This is very not good for them. But the government should have a policy.
But
force the
what's
utility.
interesting in China is that in some ways what they want to do is almost like a natural experiment, because there's a fair amount of rural China that's actually off the grid, which means that this but again, I think in terms of scale, I'm trying to understand, because I know Karen, she wanders around very truly small villages. But for some of your pilot projects, were some of them, because there's also rural towns, like how big are, like tell me one quick story about one of those demos. How big is it?
One town, typically on average, one town, there are 820 households. One town.
Okay, 820 households.
Yeah,
Okay.
on average in China. And on average, I believe one household, they will have like 4 or 5 people, one household. Like what I visited in China.
Okay, so
So
still
these-
pretty small.
Yeah. So, many young people went to the urban for work already. So that's the case in China. So anyway, I'm an optimistic. With the support of the GEF, we'll slow down the urbanization in China because too many people rush to urban areas. Not good for China as well. Not only for the urban, but for the rural area as well. We need to. We would like to demonstrate the pattern or the Chongqing city. Chongqing city is very special worldwide. In Chongqing, there are over 30 million people in one city. But this city covers a lot of rural area. So we hope this city will become a model in China in the future in terms of economic development and urbanization, and maybe in the world as well. So I mean, rural people and urban people should live in one city. There's not very much difference between urban and rural. That's our goal, I hope.
Yeah, I think that we will have to at some point. I know that as you guys have been talking, I'm thinking about other meetings. One, because in the past, like I have had plenty of meetings about urbanization, and early on there was a lot of arguments about what's even a city in China, and that you have these very rural cities. That makes it you have a city, and then just the peri-urban area is actually really rural, and that's what makes I think China kind of unique. But maybe it could help in the renewables side because they're so close to the city. Did you want to say something, Badisha? No? Okay. Some other questions. This gentleman in the front row and then in the back. So could you each give them a microphone? We'll do 1-2 questions, one after another.
Chris McRae, Norman McRae Foundation. So I'm doing some research for a coalition of universities, and they're trying to find things which teachers and students can study which match Ban Ki-moon's challenge. You've probably heard of the GCA.org, the
what? Sorry.
Global Climate Adaptability Network, which Ban Ki-moon is leading. And what's interesting about that is adaptability means analyzing the big risks of not doing things. And then if you can match that with local things which can scale up. And from what you said, I can see lots of possibilities on the energy side, but I didn't really catch hold of anything that Chinese and American students could do more on the agricultural side. So are there 1 or 2 examples of what we could be looking at of that sort, which
So on the soil and
which could sort of accelerate cooperation between Chinese and American students and grow something? Because I mean, a lot of things that are local aren't really competitive. They need to be replicated everywhere where they work. What is an example of that in agriculture?
Okay. All right, we'll hold that question and then take the second question in the back there. Thank you. We're going to gather 2 and then.
Yeah, this is a question for Pipa. Is it Pipa or Pippa?
Pipa, but it's
Pipa.
It's a nickname. I'm offended.
Yeah, you talked about like ecosystem.
And who are you? Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm Ross Martin. I'm just a concerned citizen.
Okay.
Yeah, you mentioned the ecosystem markets and farmers selling their carbon and things like that, and then obviously the ecosystem markets are broader scale. What are the biggest barriers to that? I know you mentioned that they don't have the technical assistance to be able to measure the carbon in their soils or that's sequestered properly. Is that the biggest obstacle, or are there other compounding variables there that factor into that being tough to get done?
Was there a third quick question I can grab right now? Okay, right here. Third question. 3 is a good number.
Thank you very much. And my question is primarily for Badisha, but also for other panelists. We all know that both in the US and China, digital divides remain a very big issue in rural area. So I want to know how digital divide still may be a challenge for your organization's effort to promote climatic actions. I'm a fellow here at the Wilson Center. I'm also a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Wen Hong Chen.
Thank you. All right, so we got a few questions there. Badisha, do you want to pick one part of any of them that you want to
Sure,
start
I can
with?
start with the last one. So yeah, I think one area that we referred to briefly in the report is broadband, which is a huge gap in rural areas, access to broadband. So there's been some thinking on how you can do that, and sort of this isn't perfect, but you can, if you're also trying to upgrade the grid in rural areas, there's just like a lot of infrastructure upgrading that needs to happen, and how can you tie those together and maybe have like a dig once approach where you're, laying broadband and also laying out different, transmission lines and other things that are able to get to areas. But I think those are really important technologies or infrastructure in order to be able to, when you talk about precision ag and these other technologies that require a lot of, data and capacity to be able to roll those out effectively, that's definitely an area that's going to require some investment.
Yeah, I actually think data is kind of the answer to all three of these questions.
Yeah, I know. It's like,
I'm not sure about the U.S.-China connection on data, but certainly I think that a big barrier right now is farmers. I mean, they're producing gigatons of data off their farms in the U.S. Everything they drive is connected to the cloud. Really high-end farmers are flying drones over their field to see what their pest issues are, and so I do have a little bit of a concern that our universities are not training agronomists to be data managers, data interpreters, people who can take that data and help farmers make better decisions on their farms. That's a barrier to markets. So it depends on kind of what day you catch me, what I think the biggest barrier to markets are. Some are kind of on the input end of, how you get growers to actually create these outcomes that can be monetized. But personally, I think the biggest barrier to every market is buyers. And if you don't have demand at the end of the day for your carbon, your water quality, whatever, then there's no reason to make a market. And so it's hard to envision in the U.S. a highly functioning market that's paying growers what they need for carbon without some kind of national climate policy. But maybe it could happen.
I'm going to inject there because I remember years ago because I've done a lot with water, U.S.-China water, and I remember I had a guy who used to be head of the New York Environmental Protection Department, and Al Appleton, and he was the guy who came up, I don't know if you know, came up with the idea where New York was about to build more wastewater treatment plants for the supply. You know the story, and he said, no, we're going to pay the farmers up in the Catskills to protect the water. And then, and so what's crazy, a lot of Americans don't know this, New York, a lot their water is supplied. I mean, obviously they still have to treat it, put things in it before you drink it, but it's a beautiful payment for environmental services. But when you look around the world, there's nothing, is there as much at scale? I mean, that's water, but it was a municipally led one. And I like it because it was a city linked to the farmers.
Yeah, well, so this is an interesting policy limitation, is that in the U.S., most municipalities can only spend money on their water quality within their physical geography. So New York was able to, it kind of depends.
Break the rules.
Yeah, or it just depends on how they were established. Mm-hmm. So there's a few others. There's some in the Midwest we've been looking at where the municipality does have the legal authority to spend money outside of their footprint, but that's a limitation to that model.
And water's great because water flows, but soil...
Well, when it flows, it's a bad thing.
Yeah, but in terms of like a payment for environmental services, I think we'd be remiss if we're talking about like education on ag issues between the U.S. and China and not ask the professor on the panel who actually works on ag issues in both countries. Did you have something you wanted to say about maybe I think he was thinking to not only teaching folks here, but, U.S.-China cooperation on these kind of ag issues. We won't even call it climate.
Okay, well, in terms of looking at your, thinking about your question a little bit, we have two things that we're doing at The Ohio State University. One of them that a colleague of mine is heavily involved in is we have a program in humanitarian engineering. So, because I'm in agricultural engineering, so we have a program in humanitarian engineering where they're thinking about issues relative to other parts of the world. So, stoves, for example. Something so simple as, in talking to my colleague, for her latest lab, she had her students carry a 5-gallon bucket of water a quarter mile. And all of a sudden, are there ways we can engineer around this? So that's one particular approach. Another approach that I use is I teach a course, Environmental Issues in East Asia. And what that does is that we read papers. So we're in the professional literature, so we're reading papers about environmental issues on the other side of the planet. And when the students start the course, you know, they can't believe that this will be related to their own research. And then they find out, wait a minute, that the issues on one side of the planet are pretty much the same as on this side of the planet. The third thing that came to mind in this is, as you all were discussing about some of these obstacles for farmers in the U.S., I have to think about the difference between farmers in the U.S. and farmers in China. The average farm size in the United States is 444 acres. The average farm size in China is 1.6 acres.
So you don't need big data?
Farming in China is more like a big garden. But the incredible thing about China is they have, you know, a quarter of the agricultural land, and they've been farming it for thousands of years versus us for only a couple hundred. They have 4 to 5 times more people, and they can still feed themselves. They can still grow enough food. So in terms of looking to agriculture at that scale and how in the world are they successful is pretty eye-opening. It would be for students.
Did you have a quick comment?
Yes.
Or you can ask them questions too, real quick. We're going to wrap up.
Later I have a
There's not much later. The clock's ticking, man.
So let me address this question.
Okay, you'll have to do that. All right.
About the U.S.-China collaboration in the future, particularly for the students. This is a good question. Where I may respond to your question by one example. One of my friends, who is working for the Ministry of Finance, and he asked me one question for 2 times, but I did not answer him yet. But this is his question. He said, tell me what the Chinese people or government should do in terms of renewable energy development in the future. How do you think of the Chinese position now worldwide? Do we need to learn again from the U.S. or which area we should improve ourselves? So this is my answer to him. I said, look at the data in 2018. The U.S. had about a half a number of capacity installed in wind power. That means China had a double capacity installed. But in terms of per gigawatt or per unit of power generation, the U.S. is 60% more than China. Why? Because the upstream research or the technology development in the U.S. is much better than in China, even though the same turbine maybe. Because the U.S. did a very good research in terms of where to install the turbine and how, in terms of height or place. Because of this frontier, upstream research, the same amount of investment, U.S. can generate 60% of more energy than in China. So I advise the government of China, when you need to invest this, because this kind of investment only can be done by the government. Then the private sector does not want to invest in this. This is one thing. So China needs to learn this. Now another thing, how the U.S. people should learn from China. What the U.S. would do. That's good for your good students. I think the U.S. in students particularly, or even our professionals, should learn from China how to work not 24 hours per day, maybe 12 hours, 18 hours per day. In China, any officers, professionals, they do not sleep. For me, for example, when I contact my counterpart in China, even in the night, midnight, he will respond to me very quickly. So this is not practical in the U.S., but because of this, I think China is developing so quickly. Well, I do not encourage you to everybody to work that way.
I don't get
But-
enough sleep already. Come on.
But I mean, you should maybe encourage your students not, stop communicating with the Chinese people if they ask you to work in a later light or off night or off our times. That's the case in China. If you want to work in China, you have to adapt to their culture. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we've hit up. I mean, one thing that's nice. I think that we could agree that this issue needs to be explored more thoroughly, right? Rural U.S. China stuff. I think there's a lot of areas of more cooperation. We're going to keep looking into it. Can we thank our speakers for their great presentations today? And want to thank you guys for coming. And just note that it's still on, but the DC Environmental Film Festival is starting in about a week. Stay tuned. There's talk, a lot of stuff may be getting postponed, but hopefully we will be screening still on the 20th The Story of Plastic, which a movie about the story of plastic. Just let you guys know that the China Environment Forum and the Science and Technology and Innovation Program here, we got a grant from National Geographic to create an educational video game about plastic waste. So we're going plastic here, which also does include plastic. Karen's going to be writing a blog for me on plastic waste in ag sector in the U.S. and China. So stay tuned for that. But thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you next time. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
do have, sorry.